So guess what? It's going to turn like that for him too. Before you know it, he's going to be speaking like this. I know. That's what happens. That's what happens. Things change. We're always moving. We're always moving forward. All right, ladies and gentlemen. So as I told you, this is a topic that is kind of been with us for a while. We started it and we got interrupted. We got into another, a while back, we were on the series, we were on a track studying different Judaisms, different varieties of Jewish thought and way of life from the first century. And then as we were going and working through the diversity of Judaism, we just kind of got off track because some other topic came in and interrupted us, some special events, holidays, I don't remember what it was, and we kind of got away from it. All of the above. That things happens. Life has interruptions. And I just realized I never really finished that. So I have to come back. And now that I've been going through the history with you of all of the Pharisees and things and how they happened and the Maccabees and how that led up to, how all those events essentially led up to the emergence of Pharisees, I thought that would be a good way for me to just kind of segue into the topic and wrap it up, finish it up, and complete really the series that I didn't feel like I've completed because I left out Pharisees. That's the biggest one. So I explained to you the different varieties of Jewish groups and their different levels of observance. And as we looked at the Jewish groups, like the Essenes, for example, or the Sadducees, you realize that their theological alignments, their ideological alignments made them different, made them espouse different values and practice Judaism differently. At that time, things were not quite as standardized. There was a lot more variety in Jewish practice. And so we talked about these different groups as religious Jews, but we didn't study the Pharisees yet. And that's really what I wanted to take you in. So just a quick recap, just to kind of set the tone. Alexander the Great, he's always my starting point for that period of history that's important for us to remember. His conquests, which is 4th century BCE, so get yourself in a historical zone now. 4th century BCE, he comes in and he floods Judea and the whole entire world, the whole entire Mediterranean, basically with Greek culture. We call that Greek culture Hellenism, okay? It comes from Greek word Hellenismos, which means Greek way of living or just Greek way. Let's just put it that way. Greek way of doing anything. Whether you talk about art or literature or sports or hygiene, there's just a Greek way. There's a Greek way to think. There's a Greek way to understand the world. And so that's what we call Hellenismos. It is a way to make the whole world sort of say, go along with what Greeks do. And Greeks were a great civilization. They had wonderful things to give to this world. We still are very much in a Western society a product of that Hellenism and that development. And so much of the things of the government, for example, that we have are built. The idea of democracy comes from that world. It comes from their thinking. They were the people who fostered such an idea. And we're still living them out today. So there you go. So it's not all bad, but what happened with Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes, he desecrated the temple in 167 BCE. It says in the book of Maccabees that he arrogantly entered the sanctuary and he defiled it by setting up abomination of desolation. So you remember what he did? He set up an idol, he sacrificed a pig, he did all the things really trying to subvert Judaism and turn Judaism into Hellenism, right? Into a Greek religion. That's what he was practicing, and that's what he wanted every people that he conquered or ruled to practice. And so Jews were a conquered people, and that's what happened. So this, of course, sparked the Maccabean revolt under Judas Maccabeus. That's roughly about 160 BCE. And so this was a priest-led uprising that restored the temple in the year 164 BC. Now that's the big picture idea, yes?
There does seem to be kind of a split. Jewish authorities always seem to, they of course, hate Antiochus, but they actually have a lot of good things to say about Alexander.
Sure.
You know, that he was a bit more libertarian as long as you're loyal to his regency.
Yeah. He had no problem with Judaism.
Yeah, he had no problem with it. And so that was a big difference, though. He was.
Well, he had a respect for old religions. He had respect for ancient truths. He was of the Greek way of thinking that you don't just throw out something that has been around for a long time. It is good, it has lasted, it withstood the ages for a good reason. So you don't just cast it aside.
It was funny because when he marched into India, he actually ended up befriending a Hindu guru
Right.
from Indus River Valley area. He ended up and he followed his retinue all the way back to Babylon. Or at some point, I think he committed suti. He put himself on top of a pyre.
Okay.
But it's still like he had the most motley group of friends. To hang out with rabbis and then Hindu gurus.
Right. So, and in a Hellenistic way of thinking about the world, that's not really a problem. It's a very pluralistic way of looking at the world. Because when you live in a world where there's many gods, adding your God to a list of the ones I already, bow to, not a big deal.
Yeah.
Now, it's a big deal for Jews,
Yeah.
but not for somebody like Alexander. And he's like, okay, I have a nice collection of deities that I think are really nice, and so I'll just add yours to the same shelf, just like you would in your nice library at home or something like that. So the same idea. Obviously Alexander wasn't as bad, but the issue is tyrannical rule. And guess what? Tyrannical rule can turn even good people bad. So we talked about how a priest-led uprising of the Maccabees turned from this good, positive movement into something quite negative and oppressive. So out of this Hellenistic crisis in Judea, in the 2nd century BCE, a group of Jews rose up. They're called by historians Hasidim, pious ones, or faithful ones, devout Jews. And these devout Jews, they were lay scholars and teachers. They were not priests or anything like that. And they just kind of came to the forefront as communal leaders, as people from who know stuff, who are learned, who are educated. And they became the spiritual forebears of the Pharisees, essentially. But what's important is a lot of books won't tell you. A lot of books will tell you that Hasidim were the spiritual, sort of say, forerunners of the Pharisees. They won't tell you that they were also the forerunners of the Essenes and the Sadducees and the Zealots even. In fact, all of the Jewish movements of the 1st century that you know today and you read about in the books, they all kind of sort of build themselves on the idea of these devout Hasidim. It's just that they took these ideals and they took them in different directions. But the foundation of being zealous for the Lord and really trying to embrace their identity connected to the covenant, these different groups take it in slightly different directions. Now, I put up that picture on the screen for a good reason, because I talk about Hasidim, and I just thought I'd throw that up, because when I say Hasidim, or word Hasid, every time this is what everybody thinks about. They think about a long-bearded guy in a black hat and a suit that looks like came out of, 18th century Poland or something like that, which is why they are dressed that way, because this is the height and the peak of the Hasidic movement. This is how the greatest rabbis of the Hasidim dressed. And so I say Hasidim, people think of Hasidim who look like that. But what I want you to realize is that this name is an old name that has kind of been revived and brought back. In the 2nd century BCE, we have these people who are called Hasidim, the pious ones. From time to time, throughout Jewish history, you're going to see these movements of revival. And these people can be described as the pious ones, the ones who strive for righteousness. And so that was a generation that kind of brought about the Pharisees and the Essenes and the Sadducees and even the Zealots. And so in the series that we have been looking at all these movements, I keep bringing up this quote, and I'll refresh your mind with this quote just for now. Once again, Josephus writes in Antiquities of the Jews 17, "The Jews for a great while had 3 sects of philosophy peculiar to themselves. The sect of the Essenes, and a sect of the Sadducees, and the third sort of opinions was that of those called Pharisees. But of the 4th sect of Jewish philosophy, Judas the Galilean was the author." So there are 4 ideological movements that are listed in this short quote by Josephus. And remember, he's writing to the Romans, so he's going to call them philosophies because that's what Romans are going to think of them. They're going to think of them as philosophical schools. But we realize there's a little bit more to that than that. Yes, Mary?
Peter, does the word Hasidim come from Chesed or a
Yes.
similar word?
Chesed. Chesed. I mean, loving kindness, goodness, mercy. It's one of those words that we can't really put into English because it means all those things together. And depending on the context, we just translate it differently. But yes, it comes from the word chesed, which can mean faithfulness, it can mean righteousness, it can mean piety, it can mean goodness, kindness, love. It can mean love. A lot of times we translate, your love endures forever, right? When we sing that psalm, we say, your love endures forever. So yeah, these are the Hasidim. These are the people that are filled with love. Yeah. You should love the Lord your God. How can you be pious? Well, the most important commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart. You have to be a loving person. Love your neighbors yourself. You have to be a loving person. Love has to be a foundation of your ethical, moral core, and that's what makes you a chassid. That's what makes you a person who is righteous, who is striving for this loving kindness and goodness, and because that's what God wants us to be. So there are 4 movements that Josephus highlights for us. And we've talked about a lot. We talked about the Essenes. We talked about the Sadducees. Now we're looking at the Pharisees. We did talk about Judas the Galilean. Remember who Judas the Galilean was? No, you don't remember. Okay, you're going to have to rewatch my lectures. Judas the Galilean was a zealot. So this is the movement of the zealot. Josephus does not like zealots. He can't stand them, which is why he would even not mention them by name. He just says, Judas the Galilean, who led people astray. He was the author of this movement. And then after that he says, we're not going to even talk about him anymore. He just kind of just brushes him off and says, we're not going to even go down that road because he's not even worth discussing. Yeah, that much he doesn't like him. So he does talk about zealots, but he very much dislikes them because in his personal life, in Josephus' life, zealots are the ones who caused the most damage to Judaism. The militant Jews who would not find a way to make peace with being conquered by Rome. At any cost, they were willing to sacrifice however many lives they needed, theirs and everybody else's, to basically rise up against Rome. And Rome brutally crushed people who rose up against them. And so a handful of zealots will rise up, but then thousands of more of innocent Jews who did not rise up will end up paying with their lives. So people like Josephus says, we can't fight Rome. We need to make peace. We need to find a way to live with them because we can't beat them. And zealots, they could not accept that. So they kept pushing on the other side. And that brought death, essentially, to Israel. And you realize, for Jewish people, life is the most important thing. Living another day, worshiping Hashem, is more important than being independent, so to say. So we would take a life of subjugation and dependence if we can worship Hashem, versus just fighting for freedom and dying and having our entire generations wiped out and gone.
That's why Asada at the end, what happened is because they knew that they would
Right.
have the freedom to worship Hashem.
Yeah, exactly. So there's our history is filled with drama and difficult moments like that. But that's why Josephus is so upset at zealots that he won't even talk about them that much. But he just kind of brushes them off. So there are 4 ideological movements that we see in this particular quote, but were more than 4. I want you to realize there were more than 4 because each one of them kind of splintered into others as well. It's just that we don't know much about them. These are the most prominent groups, and if I was telling somebody about people, those are the ones that I'm going to mention. Like if you ask a question today about Judaism in America, and they would say, oh yeah, there's the Orthodox Jews, there's the Reformed Jews, there's the Conservative Jews, and maybe there's Reconstructionist Jews. Most people won't even know about Reconstructionist Jews. And they would mention Messianic Jews, they would never mention. Why? Because we're not worth talking about, because we're just out there, We're not significant. So guess what? This is what Josephus does. He will mention the big 4, and everybody else, they're not significant enough. You don't need to know about them. The big 4 is the ones you need to know. And so we are like that. We talk about the major groups, the major players, so to say, and that's what he does. So Pharisees, they're definitely a major player. So people often equate the rabbis of the Mishnah and the Gemara with Pharisees. I've heard this many times. They say, well, isn't Pharisees are like what we have today is rabbis. The rabbis are Pharisees are rabbis, one and the same. And I think it's a stretch, and I actually think it's a mistaken opinion to kind of connect them that way, kind of put an equal sign to them. And there's a reason why I think that, and perhaps maybe I will be able to help you see that, why I don't make that connection per se, not an exact way. The Pharisees did lay a very firm foundation for what we know today as Rabbinic Judaism, or mainstream Judaism, because guess what? Rabbinic Judaism is mainstream Judaism. There is another contender of Judaism, Karaite Judaism, but they're just a few thousand people. That's about it. At some points they did have much larger numbers, but they didn't survive as a mainstream movement. So there's mainstream Judaism, and that is Rabbinic Judaism. That is a Judaism of the rabbis, the traditions that the rabbis have passed on and taught and shared with their students. That's the tradition that endures. That is the tradition that endures into today. Have any one of you met a Karaite Jew in real life? Not on the internet. There's one on the internet that just everybody knows about because he puts his YouTube videos everywhere. But in real life, have you ever met one?
Yes, well,
And you probably never will, because there's just a handful of them. That's it. The Chicago Samaritans, yeah. We talked about Samaritans. Samaritans are a small community, and they still endure, and so are the Karaites.
Could you just, like in a nutshell, what are the Karaites?
Karaites were a stream of Judaism that opposed rabbinic tradition in the days of the Babylonian academies. When the Babylonian tradition, with Gemara, when the Babylonian Talmud was being put together, and Mishnaic tradition was being developed further and further. This is like 4th, 5th, 6th centuries. There arose a group of Jews who said, we don't need all these traditions. We could just read the Torah like it is and understand it. It's plain, it's simple. We can just understand it. We don't need all this explanation, all this commentary. We can just read it for what it is. Well, if that sounds familiar to you, that's exactly what Sadducees said, by the way. And we don't need all this tradition. We don't need this lore. We don't need the stories. We can read what the Torah says, and Torah doesn't say anything about it. Therefore, we're not going to do anything about it because the Torah doesn't say anything about it. Well, guess what? Torah doesn't say a lot of things about a lot of things. It's a limited document. However, when you have a living tradition, you realize that these ideals imprint over on everything else in life. But if you are a literalist, like a Sadducee or a Karaite, you would say, oh, the Torah doesn't say anything about it. I don't have to do anything about it. I'm just going to stay to this narrow, path that's laid out for me. And so they were the sola scriptura guys of that day. Okay, if you want to think of it this way.
Kind of like the church.
The Sadducees were like the Kohanim, and they were sacrificing animals in
Right.
a way that was not written down, that they had to follow oral tradition to do it. So it's that they were saying one thing and doing another.
In the end, Karaites did develop their own tradition because you can't live without tradition. It's just not possible. As much as you would like to try, there are thousands of things that you do every single day that is guided by tradition. And if I just go through your life and start pointing and identifying that everything you do, that it's not written. None of that is written, but you do it, and you do it religiously, and you make a big deal about it. It's tradition. It's okay to have tradition. They just kind of wanted to reject the tradition. Why? Because they wanted to create an alternative tradition. So essentially that's what they did. And Karaites, they're still around, but they have a few synagogues. I think there's maybe like 1 or 2 in Israel or something like that. They're small. Every once in a while you'll see them pop up. But as a influential movement in Judaism, they certainly are not. But there's the mainstream, and the mainstream embraces the traditions of the rabbis, and that means embraces the heritage that the Pharisees laid as the foundation, because the rabbis have taken a lot of the heritage from the Pharisees and they took it. But what you don't realize is that as they produced all these documents and learning in the Babylonian academies, and Jerusalem Talmud came and Babylonian Talmud came, they advanced way beyond the Pharisaic ideas. They may have started with Pharisaic ideas as the foundation, but they've moved way beyond that. So what Judaism has become in the later periods is not exactly Pharisaism, let's put it that way. They've taken it to the next level. They've incorporated the broader understanding, much, much broader understanding. I'd say Pharisees were way more narrow-minded. The Jewish understanding of what Jewish is and what it means to be faithful to the Torah that they have developed, the rabbis have developed, was way more bigger and grander and more encompassing than Pharisees have ever achieved. And so in that sense, it's not fair to just call the rabbis Pharisees. You see what I'm saying? Because they have definitely grown. And I could show that to you, but it will take me a little while to kind of show the progression to you of how that happened. You'd have to become a little bit more of a student of Judaism to follow down these trails. But nevertheless, people do make that equation. I think it's not entirely accurate or fair, but let's just leave it as it is and we'll keep moving. So the Pharisees, Perushim as they're called. Perushim means separated ones. That's what it literally means. Perushim. A Perush is the one who is a separatist, if you want to call him that. They're not called such because of isolation, but because their drive towards holiness. If you understand what holiness is, what Kedusha is, being set apart, being holy, being distinct, being different, that's what they are, sort of say, why they're called separatists. Why do they stand aside and don't fit in with the majority? They are a minority. A minority that says, we're not going to go the way that everyone else goes. We have a righteous path that we believe God has given us, and we're going to follow it, and we're not going to depart from it. So if that makes me a minority, that's okay. I'll be a separatist. I'll be a Parush. I'll be a Pharisee. The Pharisees, in the end, were a very vibrant movement, very popular movement, and their popularity, their vigor, sort of say, what they've given to Jewish people historically goes back to the Second Temple period. And so what is the Second Temple period? From about 516 BCE to 70 CE. Why do we call it the Second Temple period? Because that's when the Zerubbabel restores the temple. Ezra and Nehemiah come back from Babylon, they restore the temple, rebuild Jerusalem, and the period of the Second Temple, not the Solomon's temple, but the Zerubbabel's temple, now continues. And then, of course, Herod expands it, improves it, beautifies it, does all kinds of wonderful things to make that temple even better, but it's still Zerubbabel's temple, essentially, that has never fallen since the days of the restoration after Babylon. They may have come close, like the Maccabean Wars, right? But they never really just got destroyed and fallen until the year 70, when Romans came in and they completely demolished the temple. So, as a movement, this is where Pharisees fit into. They fit into that Second Temple period, and some of their early roots, the contributions that they brought about, the thought, the way they understood the world as Jews. They were very instrumental in bringing the light of Torah to the everyday lives of just countless ordinary Jews. That's probably the biggest contribution that the Pharisees have brought. They brought the light of Torah to an everyday, average Jew. They basically said, just because you're not some special person, you're not a priest, you're not a dignitary, you're not a royal, you don't have anything, you're just a peasant, you're just a farmer, that doesn't mean that you cannot have a rich spirituality in your everyday life. In fact, your home can be a house of prayer. It can be a holy place. Your table can be holy. That's the ethic of Pharisees. They gave us this idea that God can be with us nearby and close, and we can worship Him right where we are, versus, oh, no, I have to go to the temple. I have to pray there. I have to bring a sacrifice, because that's my only way of communing with God. No, Pharisee says, you can commune with God right where you are. You're in a field, you can worship God in the field. Right there, right where you're harvesting. That doesn't mean that you can't worship Hashem right there.
What about the hand washing stuff?
Yeah.
Because your house being
Yeah, a lot of the traditions and customs of purity and holiness that we practice today, they're all Pharisaic customs. They all come from them, and we still follow their suit, in our daily lives. Because what they are showing to us is that there's holiness that exists with us today, here, right where we are. Not in just some place that's lifted up like the temple, but it could be right here with us. And so we treat our lives as holy. And that is the heritage that we get from the Perushim, from the Pharisees. Now, a quick recap of history again. Remember Alexander Jannaeus? I told you about him. He famously clashed with Pharisees. He had a full-on war. They challenged his authority. And he executed thousands of them. He actually crucified them. That's the story. thousands of Pharisees were classified by a Jewish king, would-be king, a priest essentially, a Sadducee. And so that might give you an idea of why Sadducees and Pharisees did not like so much each other. But even earlier, the conflict was between his father, John Hyrcanus I, who was the father of Alexander Jannaeus. This is year 134 through 104 BCE. He was a high priest who ruled as a king. And the Pharisees, of course, well, they were right there besides him, and they had a clash. And this episode of their clash appears in Antiquities 13. Again, Josephus preserved the story for us. And this clash with John Hyrcanus I could be perhaps classified as the first distinct cohesive emergence of Pharisees as the group that criticized John Hyrcanus and his overreach. You realize he's a priest who's not supposed to be a king, but he won't give up his administrative rule as the king. He wants to be both, the priest and the king. He wants to have the temple and the kingdom. And the Pharisees had a problem with that. They realized that is not right. It's not according to the Torah. It is wrong in so many ways, and they challenged him. And as you can imagine, just like Jannaeus fought with them, his father before him also fought with the Pharisees. And Josephus preserves this for us in his Antiquities of the Jews. So here's a little excerpt here for you. I didn't want to do a big long passage, but just a little snippet here to give you an idea. So Josephus writes, Hyrcanus was angry at the Pharisees because they had not forgotten the wrongs he had done them. So at some point they fought, then they made up, then they fought again. They kind of had this off and on relationship. And so he's still not happy with them. He says, but when Eliezer, who was one of the principal Pharisees, seeing that Hyrcanus was in a good humor, meaning he probably had some wine or something like that, said to him, if you desire to be righteous, lay down the high priesthood and content yourself with the civil government of the people. You want to be the king? Fine, be the king. But you can't be the king and the priest. Hyrcanus was enraged and put to death Eliezer and many others. He also dissolved the councils of the Pharisees and put to death many of them and drove the rest into exile. Now remember, this is just the beginning. And this particular clash, as it happened, Josephus tells us several hundred Pharisees died. I remember he gives us a number like 600 or 800 or something like that. So still a lot of people. Remember, Israel, we're small. So for us, 600 or 800 people is a lot. And they end up dying because they challenged a man who has the control of the temple and the military. And so he started persecuting them, and he dismissed their council, he dismissed their learning places, so that means the places where they studied were crashed and burned probably, and so the Sanhedrin, or word Sanhedrin means a council, he dismissed it. He's like, I don't need these people counseling me, because they obviously are against me. They just challenge my authority. So Josephus tells us stories like this, and these stories are indicative of a very turbulent and a very difficult relationship between the Maccabean kings and the Pharisees, because you already see Pharisees rising up as an ideological movement that is very principled. They are dying. They're literally dying for their stance. They are not very political. They don't want to be political. Every time they get meddled with politics, they're the ones who end up dying. And Pharisees eventually learned their lessons and tried to be the least political they possibly can be, because they realize with politics and power, bloodshed will always follow. So that's what they did. And tradition tells us that survivors of this war with Alexander Jannaeus, the elders like Simeon ben Shetach, who lived in about 100 BC to 70 BC, they basically rebuilt the movement through alliances with Queen Salome Alexandra. Remember that story I told you? Now, in this era, the Pharisees, they basically dominated the Sanhedrin, because when Salome ruled, she turned to them for advice. And she reconstituted the council, the ruling council that we call the Sanhedrin. This was a council of communal leaders who made laws and helped govern the people alongside of the queen. So Shalom Tzion reigned together with the Pharisees. And Josephus actually says that while she gave him so much leeway that basically the Pharisees made all the rules in the whole entire land, she just leaned on them. Why? Because they had more sense religiously of where people were than she was. She's a queen. And they were in the synagogues with the people, so they understood where the populace was, and therefore they made rules and laws that were more fitting for the society at that time. So all the wars, all the turbulence, eventually there's these moments of rebuilding. And the name of the person I mentioned there, Simeon ben Shetach, is important. I'll explain to you who he was in just a minute. As we read traditional Jewish texts, such as the Mishnah, they often mention the men of the Great Assembly. You probably heard that name, right? Well, though the members of this group, which functioned for many generations, they're not so well defined. It's not like we can just go to the book somewhere and just say, okay, here are the men of the Great Assembly, and they're all listed in chronological order. No such luck. That's not how history works. They're not so well defined. We do have the names of some of them, and one of them was Simeon ben Shetach, and he's known to us, and there's many others that are known to us. And so what I wanted to talk to you today about is about these leaders that emerged from the community. This is a very organic way in which they rose up. There were 5 pairs of leaders. In Hebrew, they're called zugot. These are sages. These are scholars. They led a council body, which Sanhedrin is just the Greek word for a council. And most of the time people hear the word Sanhedrin, they think like Supreme Court or something like that. Not exactly like that. It's just a generic word for a council. Every council is a Sanhedrin, okay? You can have a local communal council and you would call it a Sanhedrin. It's just the Greek word. So there were these 5 pairs of leaders who led the main council body in Jerusalem. And they sort of formalized Pharisaic ideals in the land. They basically were, through their leadership, through their charismatic leadership, through their lending of themselves to serve on the council, they brought a lot of values that they believed, that they embraced, and made them widespread and popular among the people. And so these 5 pairs, or these 5 zugot, these 5 sets of leaders, one of the things that they did is they democratized ethical and moral authority that is connected to Torah and study of the Torah amid the Hasmonean power struggles. And the moment when the Hasmonean kings and priests, or priest kings, are battling for power, trying to take it away from each other by any means necessary, these people are saying the real authority, the real ethical, moral authority rests in the study of the Torah, because that's what God gave us. That is the covenant. That is the truth. And if you want to look to people as leaders, you should be looking to someone who embodies these ideals and these principles. And they said to the people, the Torah belongs to you, not to the elites. The Torah is yours. And if you want to study the Torah, if you want to learn, if you want to grow, you can become a teacher in Israel. You can become a person of authority by the virtue of the things you know and understand that are able to articulate and teach and pass on to other people. Because the authority that you have is really the authority of Torah. It's just you are the mouthpiece of that authority. And so essentially they democratize this idea. Now you realize that's taken away authority from some of the other people who traditionally would have held that. And so in that way, Pharisees were a little bit subversive. And you could see why Maccabean kings would not be so prone to them, because they challenged them in so many levels. They didn't want to be revolutionaries, but the things that they talked about and the things that they taught did undermine some of the traditional power structures. And that brings me to the discussion of these 5 zugot, these 5 groups of sages. They were very instrumental in the development of Judaism. And I wish we knew more about them. We know only some things. So the Mishnah, Tractate Avot, maybe you're familiar with that writing. It's a 2nd century CE document. It's probably one of the earliest components of Mishnah. It presents a chain of the transmission of this authoritative teachings of the Torah and the explanations. And it says that this chain followed all the way from Sinai. So this is what Mishnah says. Moses received the Torah from Sinai and delivered it to Joshua. Joshua to the elders to the prophets, and the prophets handed it down to the men of the great synagogue, the men of the great assembly, right? The Sanhedrin, essentially. So the text that we read portrays Zugot. They are leaders of the Sanhedrin. Portrays them as the guardians of the oral Torah, Torah Shebaal Peh, but also the written Torah. Well, the written Torah can be preserved by simply copying the scrolls. But you realize that reading the scroll does not guarantee you actually understanding what that scroll says, and doesn't guarantee you not even misinterpreting and completely misconstruing what the scroll says. So along with what the text says has to come along an explanation of what the text means. And that explanation goes all the way back, because do you not think that Moses taught Joshua some things that are not written in the 5 books of Moses?
Probably not.
Probably not, he says. We all believe you. Would it be so crazy to think that how many conversations Moses had with Joshua, how many conversations he had with Aaron, and the things that he told him and explained to him, they're not written down in the 5 books of Moses the way we have them today. Not all of God's wisdom can be encompassed on the scroll. It's just not possible. So there's so many other things that they must have explained and taught and passed on, and Joshua would teach the elders, and the elders themselves could have received it from Moses. Remember, Moses appointed 70 elders, right? And those elders were, it says, filled with Hashem's Ruach, with his spirit. They were spirit-filled people. And I'm sure he had a few training sessions with them too. They learned things. And it was passed on. And then prophets came. And the prophets, some of them come from the most humble beginnings. Some of them are farmers. They're just ordinary people. Yet God fills them with his spirit and reveals things to them they shouldn't know, sometimes supernaturally. And the prophets come and they grab onto some of these traditions and they take it and they repackage it and give it back to the people. And that's why we read the prophets, because everything the prophets say actually affirms what the Torah declares to be true. So the prophets, they hand it down. They are the next chain in transmission, and they give these teachings, these ideas to the men of the great assembly. And the great synagogue, the great assembly, they are the council. They are the people in the society who read, who study, who care, and they preserve the interpretations of traditions. Now, sometimes they may not agree about everything, because we develop all these ideas and language, human language and culture the way it is. We tend to deviate sometimes from places, but still that knowledge is preserved. And collectively, we hold on to the truth. That's how it has been for thousands of years for Jewish people. So when I talk about Torah Shebaal Peh, when I talk about the oral Torah, this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a consistency of tradition that has been with us. It doesn't mean that there isn't disagreement in some of it, but the general trajectory has been something very consistent and has been handed down. Were there perhaps some breakdowns in this chain? Of course, why not? We live in an imperfect world. But for the most part, that is what the sages pass on to us. That's what the Mishnah says. That's the chain of custody, so to say, of the Torah. Does that make sense? And upon this is what Pharisaic movement is built. This is one of the biggest things, for example, that the Sadducees argued with Pharisees about. It says you have all these traditions that you believe, and they're not written down. So we can't trust them. They're not trustworthy enough, or something like that. And so they would argue about them. And Yeshua famously argued with them as well. One of the traditions that they argued about all the time was resurrection. You realize resurrection is a tradition. It's an interpretation. It's not a fact that's recorded in the Torah. Moses never said, after you die, you're going to rise from the dead. Moses never said, not even anything close to that. Now, does the Torah teach resurrection? I actually believe it does. And I can show you where it does. But it's not just said in plain words like that. You're not going to find those words. Some of you have been reading these words for most of your life. You know what I'm talking about. It's not there, not in plain language. But the value is being taught. You just have to be able to see it. And traditions like that would become a point of huge contentions, and people would disagree, but that would change your theology in a very radical way, whether you believed it or not. So the Zugot, these pairs, they emerged as pairs of sages leading the Sanhedrin through a very interesting technique, a balanced interpretation of Torah. They were allowing for diversity of opinions and judgments to coexist in the court. That means when the council deliberates and decides, it's not like this is what we decided and this is how it is. There's always a majority opinion, there's a minority opinion. They may have an opinion that wins the day, but it doesn't mean the minority opinion is worthless. It's just the one that didn't win. So there's a balance. And they created sort of, say, this adversarial relationship, not in a negative sense adversarial, but adversarial in a sense like kind of, you've heard of this saying, being the devil's advocate. Like if you put forward a certain idea, I take the opposite side and we just argue it out and see what happens, essentially. Because somehow in the middle of all that, maybe we will come up with a really good solution. So they were doing this in the Sanhedrin, and that was the style. One of the leaders of the Sanhedrin was called Nasi. He's the president. Nasi literally means the prince. And historically, that was somebody actually from Davidic family. Somebody who actually had roots to King David. And that's why they were called the prince, because they were actually, could be slotted for a crown, if that such possibility would avail itself. And then there was another person. It was called Avbeddin, which he was like the vice president of the council and literally means the head of the court. So the court is a body, is a decision body. It's a legislative body that makes rules and decisions. Father of the house of judgment. That's how you can translate that in a very literal way, a very wooden translation. But that's what it means. He's the head of that body, that assembly. So you have the president, the vice president. And they often presented very contrasting opinions of the council, and they reached decisions, by majority consensus, which was very different from the way kings rule, right? The king says, and that's how it is. Not in Sanhedrin. And so Sanhedrin, in a sense, created a balancing power to the king, right? But then at the same time, even within themselves, there was diversity of opinion, and that was embraced. And in the end, they ruled by consensus. So imagine Queen Salome leaning on a group of people who would be business owners, noblemen of all sorts, some of them wealthy, some of them are not, maybe builders. They would be all kind of coming together like this because these are people who have livelihood, so they can spend time sitting in council deciding things, because they're actually not running their business because their business isn't big enough for somebody else to run it for them. So they have the time to devote to service because they don't have to worry about where their next meal is coming from because they're set. And so they tend to be more educated group of people, and a queen would lean on their council and they would make laws, they would make rules, they would make legislature. So that's the system of the Zugot and the Sanhedrin working together along with whoever was in power at that time. So I want to go through a list of the 5 pairs, or the 5 groups, so to say. The Zugot, like I said, they're called pairs. First one is Yosei ben Yoezer and Yosei ben Yochanan. So their dates are roughly about 170 to 140 BCE. So this first Zug, this first pair, they functioned during the Maccabean perils. This is a very turbulent time. Yosei ben Yoezer, he was called Father of the World. Very interesting title that he had. He was a lenient man. We know about some of these people we know very little, let's put it this way, because we're really delving into antiquity and records weren't always preserved that reached us. We know that he was a lenient man who allowed even for touching unclean things to study Torah. Like, meaning if you have to do something that is really not such a clean thing, but what it leads to is your ability to study Torah, he says, go ahead and do it. Because studying Torah is way more important than you being ritually defiled, let's put it that way. Say you were a tanner. Your job was a tanner. And that meant you handled hides and
Brains.
feces, And yet, that gave you a living and the ability to study Torah. You remember Peter stayed at the house of the tanner in Jaffa. It wasn't a great place probably, but at least he could support Peter. Right? He can help him out at the time when he needed a place to stay. So he taught things that other people would have said, no, we're not willing to go that far. But he says, you know what, if that's going to allow you to continue Torah learning, do that. So as a pair, they taught, make your houses houses of assembly. So basically, your house can be a house of prayer. Your house can be a house of study. They transformed the houses into batei midrash. They study halls. Any house can be a house of study, a place where people learn the Torah and practice it, and it can be holy. Now you realize that that's democratizing religion. That's taking religion out of a official space, holy space, and making your space, your private space, a holy space. Now that's a big move. This is not something that happened in society. So the fact that they would teach this, making piety, making faithfulness to God really portable. You can do this anywhere. And they looked to people like Daniel, who lived in Babylon, in a pagan society, yet he prayed every day facing Jerusalem. And he never forgot his faith. He never abandoned it. So even in a place like Babylon, you could be a righteous Jew, essentially. So for somebody like from a priestly background, they would say, I can't do that because everything that I have, my entire righteousness is based on sacrifices in the temple. This is a different idea. Your house of study can be a place of holiness, a place of spirituality. So they kind of brought that to us. Now, a second pair, Yehoshua ben Parchaya and Natai of Arbela, they were exiled during Jannaeus' persecution. So remember Alexander Jannaeus, he's the one who cracked down on the Pharisees. And Yehoshua mentions a very interesting person, a young student, Shimon ben Shetach. And Natai, he famously taught, is recorded in Pirkei Avot, keep far from an evil neighbor. So if you have a person that you know that is not such an upstanding person, just stay away from him, he said. And maybe you think that's common sense, but that's just an example of their teaching. Again, we don't have like books and books written by these people. They're just snippets of history. What we know that this particular zug emphasized is they emphasized the value of ethical community. They really focused on people being good people, moral people. And if you have people in your community who are immoral, who are bad people, create a line of separation. Don't mingle with them. Don't support them. Don't validate them, essentially. So draw lines is what they were saying. And so Yehoshua, he escaped to Alexandria, Egypt at one point. Why? Because all these persecutions of Pharisees. And he actually preserved ancient traditions, fostering a global Jewish network of preserving Torah learning. So he goes to Alexandria, Egypt, and starts spreading his teachings there. So remember, sometimes when the authorities persecute you, you got to flee. Why? Because what you're trying to save, not just your life, is you're trying to save all the knowledge and the Torah, learning that you have so you can pass it on. And so he goes to Alexandria and he starts teaching all those things there. And it actually creates a whole network of people learning Torah. Each of the pairs brought us to sort of say a next stage, or they gave us something, historically speaking, that propelled us to the next stage, and next stage, and next stage. Yehuda ben Tabai and Shimon ben Shetach is the next pair that comes. Tradition tells us that Yehuda fled to Egypt. Shimon was Salome's brother-in-law, so you could see how he might have a way back. He returned to reform the court system. He would be Shimon ben Shetach would be the one who would actually reinstitute and reconstitute the Sanhedrin. Why? Because Salome said, I want your help. I need your help. And so that was his sort of say way in. Yes.
I do know that Shimon ben Shetach he reformed the divorce and remarriage process as well. Yeah. He allowed people, for example, to take the note, the ketubah, and put it into their business. So, and he did so because he felt that it was a disincentive to divorce, meaning if you divorce somebody without cause, you would have to liquidate your business.
Yes.
After having invested all that money. So he allowed you to take the ketubah and invest it into a business, thinking that it would incentivize people to be more
Right. It
adherent.
would actually make people not divorce.
Yeah, yeah.
It would make it harder. It would make those bonds and those ties much more firm. Which, if you remember the teaching on divorce that Drake was doing, one of the main things about divorce was to protect the women. Ketubah was to protect a right of a woman, or so a way to survive, because women and their livelihood was not as broadly available to them at that time. They just couldn't go out and get a job, and then so the way that the world was working at that time, they needed extra protection. Ketubah provided that fallback, that income, that those money essentially they could live on for a period of time. So it was very, very important institution in Judaism that way, and divorce is, if anything, it's a very monetary type of a situation at that time. Today people are like, oh, I don't like you, I divorce you. I'm like, no, at that time it was all about money and land and property and things like that. So big deal. So this particular zug, Yehuda ben Tabai and Shimon Beshetach, they made the rules of testimony stricter. One of the contributions they brought about, they said, examine witnesses thoroughly. Don't just believe people because they said what they said. Actually, question them, examine them. See if you can poke some holes into what they're saying, because they could be lying. So they kind of brought this idea of cross-examining the witnesses, if you want to think about it that way. We still practice these things today, right? We don't just believe a person's word just because they said. We actually cross-examine a witness. So this is their contribution. And so they rooted out judicial corruption. There was rampant judicial corruption at that time. Basically, they elevated Pharisaic tradition and the rules of the Pharisees over the Sadducean favoritism. Sadducees, it was all about who you know. It's all about, oh, I know so-and-so. They owe me a favor now, and I'm just going to rule in their favor and make sure that when I need a favor, I can come to them because I ruled in their favor. And that was very, very corrupt system, essentially. And so they brought in some reforms, and the judicial system got more fair. So under Salome, these particular Pharisees, they regained Sanhedrin control, and that's when it says that the people Pharisees made all the rules. We're talking about Yehuda ben Tabai and Shimon Beshetach. They would be the leaders of the Sanhedrin of that particular generation, where all the Pharisees got to make the rules for the land, and the Sadducees kind of got pushed aside. So another pair, a famous one, Shemaiah and Avtalion. According to some traditions, they were both proselytes. It's very, very interesting. So according to tradition recorded in Gittin 57b, this is in Babylonian Talmud, they were actually both Gentile converts. Yet they were the president and the vice president of the Sanhedrin in the land of Israel in Jerusalem. And that's remarkable. That tells you something about Judaism at that time. Shemaiah, he was supposed to have taught, love work, hate mastery. A very short dictum, but basically it says, there's nothing wrong with working with your hands, but don't look at being a boss and being a master and being a supervisor and being over many, many other people as something as privileged and alluring. Just work. Just work with your hands. Just do the job and don't worry about going after being the boss, essentially. And so that's what he meant. Together, Shemaiah and Avtalion, they advanced the value of service in humility in the middle of this shadow of Herod's opulent and very oppressive reign. So this is a generation of sages that rules and makes halacha, essentially, makes the rules of applying Torah to everyday life in the days when Herod the Great is in charge. He has taken over now the land. Because remember what happened with the Maccabees. He muscles his way in, and the Romans give him the power. Maccabean kings are out. They've discredited themselves completely. So that's, their generation is the Herod the Great generation. And they trained the next generation of disciples like Hillel. Hillel comes from them. And their study circle particularly emphasized practical ethics for common people. That is what they taught. They taught humility, and they talked about common people can live good, moral, ethical lives. How do we do that? How do we do this every single day? That's what they worked on, and that's the foundation they laid. And of course, the next one I've already mentioned, Hillel, you would know him. Hillel and Shammai, they're the best known of the Zugot pairs. They're the most famous one. Hillel, who rose from poverty of Babylon, we're told, he emerged as a very lenient sage who tended to make rulings and rules that were more permissive to people. The way that he ruled halacha made it easier to obey the Torah. Where Shammai, he was a wealthy builder who rose up as a more strict and much more rigorous teacher. He tended to be much more structured in many of his rulings. And again, you could see how they balance each other. Each one of these pairs, they bring something to the table, but not in more of the same, but in more of a different contribution. So both of Hillel and Shammai have contributed very much to Judaism. Hillel's standing on one foot Torah ethic, remember that story where a Gentile comes to Hillel and says, tell me what, I want to know the whole Torah, but I want to do it while I'm standing on one foot. How long do you think you can stand on one foot if I asked you to do that? Like, how many minutes could you do that? So that's all the time I have to teach you the entire Torah, right? Basically, right? And Hillel actually says, okay, sure, I'll do that. And he tells them, what you don't want to be done to you, don't do to others. That's the Torah. The rest is commentary. Come see me later. I'll teach you the rest. It's easy to do, right? What is hateful to you, do not do to other people. Shammai had a very different reaction. He chases him away. He says, how you fool dare ask me to teach you Torah while you're standing on one foot? I'm not going to do that. Go away. So they're very different temperament. They have different people, different approach. But Shammai, he had zeal. And he codified a lot of debates, a lot of arguments that happened in his day. And so he amassed thousands of students. Shammai was a very prolific teacher. He had a lot of people following him. And their stories are fascinating. So in the upcoming sessions, I'll reveal to you the heart of Pharisaic thinking and values through the stories that we actually have preserved about Hillel and Shammai. What people don't realize is that Pharisees are also not just one and the same. There are Pharisees who are more like Hillel, and there are Pharisees who are more like Shammai. And that means that they will disagree with each other. Sometimes bitterly, sometimes to the core. And that makes them not as a cohesive group as everybody imagines them to be. Sometimes when we read like the Gospels or something like that, people walk away with this idea of like, oh, the Pharisees, they're just all mean-spirited, terrible people. Not exactly. If you read carefully, you will see that some of them are very positive. Some of them very enthusiastic about the things that Yeshua says and he teaches, and they invite him over for dinner and things like that. And some, they're plotting somewhere in the shadows how to do away with this guy because he's a problem. So they're not all the same. And understanding some of the dynamic between disagreements like Hillel and Shammai, it makes us really understand what was driving Pharisees, what was their movement is all about, what were their ethics, what were their values, what are the things that they put on the highest pedestal there is. And if we understand those things, I think a lot of things in the first century spirituality of Jewish people will start making sense to us. And later, spirituality of the rabbis, of the Mishnah, the Gemara will make much more sense because, of course, that is all built on the foundation that the Pharisees established. So that's what we'll do. We'll get into those stories in the next session. I'll save that for later. All right?